The most powerful woman in the city vanished the night she discovered her husband's betrayal, but her disappearance was just the beginning of the most spectacular comeback anyone had ever witnessed. The champagne flutes clinked like wind chimes in the opulent ballroom of the Metropolitan Club, but the real music was the symphony of whispered secrets that danced from lip to ear across the marble floors. Tonight, like every night for the past 4 months, the conversation inevitably circled back to her, Clara Ashworth, the woman who had simply disappeared. Have you seen her? Margaret Pemberton leaned closer to her circle of perfectly coiffed socialites, her voice dropping to that delicious octave reserved for the most scandalous gossip. Not once. Not at the country club, not at the charity luncheons, not even at Bergdorf's. The women exchanged knowing glances, their eyes gleaming with the cruel satisfaction that comes from witnessing someone else's downfall from a safe distance. They all remembered Clara, poised, elegant Clara who had graced every important event on Daniel Ashworth's arm for 15 years. Clara, who had transformed that rough-around-the-edges businessman into society's golden boy. Clara, who had made their marriage look like something out of a fairy tale. But fairy tales, as everyone knew, were just pretty lies told to little girls. "I heard she's been hiding in that penthouse," whispered Amanda Sterling, adjusting her pearl necklace with the precision of someone who had perfected the art of looking concerned while secretly reveling in another's misery. Completely devastated, apparently. Gained 20 pounds, stopped doing her hair. You know how these things go. The truth was, nobody knew anything. Clara Ashworth had vanished from their world as completely as if she'd never existed, leaving behind only the echo of her husband's betrayal and the lingering scent of her signature perfume in rooms that suddenly felt too large and too empty. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away in the penthouse suite of the Meridian Hotel, Daniel Ashworth was very publicly moving on with his life. At 38, he had traded his 42-year-old wife for Sienna Cross, 26, ambitious and beautiful in that sharp, angular way that photographs well but leaves no room for warmth. She was everything Clara wasn't. Hungry where Clara had been content, calculating where Clara had been generous, cold where Clara had been the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday and sent handwritten thank you notes. Sienna had been Daniel's business consultant, a title that fooled absolutely no one, but allowed everyone to pretend they were shocked when the affair became public. She had worked her way into his company, his bed, and ultimately his life with the methodical precision of a chess master, each move calculated to position herself as the new Mrs. Ashworth. The affair had been going on for 8 months before. Clara found out, and when she did, the confrontation had been swift and brutal. Daniel, caught between guilt and desire, had chosen the easier path. He'd chosen Sienna. The divorce papers were filed within weeks, the settlement generous, but swift. Clara had taken her half of their fortune and disappeared, while Daniel had taken Sienna public with unseemly haste. Now, 4 months later, they were the city's new power couple. Daniel's business was thriving. The young, beautiful wife was good for his image, attracted younger clients, made him feel like he was winning at life. Sienna had quit her consulting job and thrown herself into the role of trophy wife with theatrical enthusiasm, attending every gallery opening, every charity function, every opportunity to be photographed looking stunning on Daniel's arm. But there was something else in those photographs if you looked closely, something tight around Daniel's eyes, something forced about his smile. Sometimes, in unguarded moments, his gaze would wander to the empty spaces where Clara used to be, the chair at their favorite restaurant where she used to sit, reading the menu aloud in that warm, melodic voice. The passenger seat of his car where she used to keep a small notepad, jotting down gift ideas for people they barely knew, because she never forgot anyone's story. Sienna had noticed these moments too, though she pretended not to. Instead, she doubled down on her campaign to erase Clara from their social circle's memory. She wore Clara's favorite color, emerald green, to every event. She had her hair styled in the same chignon Clara had favored. She even convinced Daniel to take her to Clara's favorite restaurant, where she ordered Clara's usual dish and laughed too loudly at Daniel's jokes. But Clara's absence was like a phantom limb. The more Sienna tried to fill the space, the more obvious it became that something essential was missing. The society pages still mentioned her name in passing, wondering aloud where she'd gone, what she was doing. Some speculated she'd moved to Paris. Others whispered about a nervous breakdown, a retreat to a Swiss spa, a complete reinvention. The truth was far more interesting than any of their theories, but Clara Ashworth had always been full of surprises. She had spent 15 years being the perfect society wife, supporting Daniel's ambitions, hosting his clients, charming his business partners. She had made sacrifices they would never know about, dreams she had quietly set aside to build his empire alongside him. Now, for the first time in 15 years, Clara was building something for herself. And when she was ready, when the moment was perfect, the city would discover just how much they had underestimated the woman they thought they knew. The whispers would continue for now, growing more elaborate with each retelling, painting pictures of a broken woman hiding in shame. But Clara wasn't hiding. She was preparing. And soon, very soon, she would remind everyone exactly who she was before she became Daniel Ashworth's wife. She would remind them who she had always been, underneath it all. The ivory invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, sliding through the mail slot of Daniel's downtown office like a small, elegant missile. His secretary, Janet, brought it in with his coffee and the morning's correspondence, but even she paused when she saw the embossed gold lettering of the Children's Hospital Foundation. "The annual Sapphire Gala," Daniel read aloud, his voice carrying that tone of satisfaction reserved for men who have been invited to all the right places. The event was still 3 months away, December 15th at the Grand Ballroom of the Plaza, but invitations to the Sapphire Gala were extended only to the city's most influential philanthropists. It was the charity event of the season, where million-dollar donations were made with the casual air of ordering wine, and where being photographed at the right table could solidify your place in high society for another year. Sienna practically snatched the invitation from his hands when he brought it home that evening, her eyes lighting up with the fierce joy of a woman who had finally been admitted to the inner circle. "This is it," she breathed, pressing the heavy cardstock to her chest. "This is our moment, Daniel. Everyone who matters will be there." She was right, of course. The Sapphire Gala was where reputations were made and demolished, where alliances were formed over champagne and caviar, where the city's elite came to see and be seen. For Sienna, it would be her formal debut as Daniel's wife. Their marriage had been a quiet courthouse affair just 2 weeks prior, deliberately low-key to avoid any lingering scandal. But the gala would be their grand introduction to society, as a married couple. "I'm thinking midnight blue," Sienna continued, already planning her outfit with military precision. "Or maybe deep burgundy, something that photographs beautifully. The Times always covers this event, and Vogue sometimes sends a photographer." She was pacing now, her mind racing through possibilities. "We'll need to make sure we're seated at one of the premier tables. Maybe next to the Weatherbys. Their tech empire is exploding right now." Daniel nodded absently, but his mind had wandered to other galas, other years. Clara had always loved this event, not for the social positioning or the photo opportunities, but because she genuinely cared about the cause. She had served on the hospital's board for 5 years, had personally visited the children's wing monthly, had known the names and stories of dozens of young patients. The foundation had been her passion project, and Daniel had supported it primarily because it made Clara happy. The thought of her brought an unexpected pang of something. Not quite regret, but a hollow feeling, like walking into a room and forgetting what you'd come looking for. For 3 weeks, the anticipation built. Sienna had her dress specially made by a designer whose name she dropped into every conversation. She booked appointments with the city's most exclusive hairstylist and makeup artist. She studied the guest list like a general preparing for battle, memorizing names, connections, and potential networking opportunities. The society pages buzzed with excitement. The Ashworth debut, as one columnist dubbed it, had become the most anticipated aspect of an already highly anticipated evening. Sienna had carefully orchestrated a series of smaller appearances leading up to the gala, each one building momentum for their grand entrance. She was methodical, strategic, and utterly determined to claim her place at the top of the social hierarchy. But then, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, just 2 weeks before the event, something unexpected happened. Janet knocked on Daniel's office door with an unusual expression, something between confusion and curiosity. "Mr. Ashworth," she said carefully, "I just received a call from the Foundation's office. They're finalizing the seating arrangements and wanted to confirm—" She paused, consulting her notes. "They wanted to confirm that Mrs. Clara Ashworth would be attending." The words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Daniel felt something cold and sharp twist in his stomach. That must be a mistake," he said slowly. "Clara isn't— We're not—" But Janet was shaking her head. "I asked them to double-check. Apparently, Mrs. Ashworth, Clara Ashworth, confirmed her attendance 3 weeks ago. She's already selected her seating preference and submitted her dietary restrictions." The news spread through the city's social circles like wildfire in a drought. Within hours, every society matron, every gossip columnist, every person who had spent the last 8 months speculating about Clara's disappearance was buzzing with the same questions. Was she really going to show up? What would she look like after all this time? How would she handle seeing Daniel with his new wife? Some people, like many who subscribe for more stories of human drama and redemption, knew that the most interesting moments in life often come when someone who's been written off decides to reclaim their narrative. Margaret Pemberton called Amanda Sterling within minutes of hearing the news. "She wouldn't dare," Margaret whispered into the phone, though her voice carried more hope than conviction. "After all this time, after the humiliation, she can't possibly think she can just waltz back in there." But Amanda was less certain. "You didn't know Clara the way I did," she said thoughtfully. "Before Daniel, before all of this, she was different, stronger. Maybe she's remembering who she used to be." Sienna's reaction was swift and volcanic. She stormed through their penthouse apartment, her carefully maintained composure cracking for the first time in months. "How dare she?" she raged, throwing the morning paper across the room. "This is our night, our debut. She has no right to—" "Be there." Daniel tried to calm her, but his own emotions were in turmoil. The thought of seeing Clara again, after 8 months of silence, 8 months of wondering what she was doing, how she was healing, filled him with a complex mixture of dread and something else he didn't want to examine too closely. "She's probably planning some kind of scene," Sienna continued, her voice rising. "Some pathetic attempt to win you back or embarrass us publicly. We should call the Foundation. Tell them she's not welcome." But even as she said it, Sienna knew it was impossible. Clara had been a major supporter of the Children's Hospital Foundation for years. Her personal donations alone had funded an entire wing. She had every right to be there, more right than Sienna herself, if you were keeping score. As December 15th approached, the anticipation reached fever pitch. The society columns speculated endlessly about what Clara might wear, how she might look, what her strategy could possibly be. Some predicted she would appear broken and desperate, making a fool of herself in front of everyone who mattered. Others whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, Clara Ashworth was planning something none of them had seen coming. The truth was, Clara had been planning for much longer than any of them realized. And when the night arrived, the city would discover that they had underestimated not just her strength, but her capacity for reinvention. The game was about to change, and Clara Ashworth was ready to play. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel had been transformed into a glittering winter wonderland, with thousands of sapphire blue lights cascading from the ceiling like frozen stars. The cream of New York society mingled beneath crystal chandeliers, their conversations creating a sophisticated symphony of clinking glasses and polite laughter. At precisely 8:15, Daniel and Sienna made their entrance. Sienna had chosen perfectly. A deep burgundy gown that hugged her athletic frame, her blonde hair swept into an intricate updo that showcased diamond earrings worth more than most people's cars. She moved through the crowd with predatory grace, her arm linked possessively through Daniel's, accepting congratulations on their recent marriage with the practiced smile of someone born to be photographed. Daniel, resplendent, in his custom tuxedo, played his part perfectly. He was charming, confident, the successful businessman who had traded up for a younger model and wasn't apologizing for it. They posed for photographers, made small talk with other power couples, and gradually made their way toward their premium. "Table near the front of the ballroom, see?" Sienna whispered as they settled into their seats, surveying the room with satisfaction. "She didn't show. All that speculation for nothing. She's probably at home with a bottle of wine and a box of tissues, watching us on social media." The thought should have brought Sienna comfort, but there was something about the way conversations kept pausing when people looked toward the entrance. Something about the way the photographers kept glancing at their cameras, as if waiting for something more interesting than another CEO and his trophy wife. At 8:45, the Foundation's president took the stage to welcome everyone and begin the evening's program. The lights dimmed slightly for his opening remarks, and in that moment of transition between the cocktail hour and the formal dinner, the ballroom's massive double doors opened one final time. Time seemed to fracture. Clara stepped into the room, and the effect was instantaneous and absolute. Conversations didn't just pause, they stopped mid-syllable. Champagne flutes froze halfway to lips. The orchestra, in the middle of a gentle Gershwin melody, actually stumbled on a note as the violinist caught sight of her and lost his place entirely. She wore a dress that defied every expectation, every whispered prediction about the broken woman who might slink back into society, begging for acceptance. The metallic gold mini dress caught every light in the room and threw it back amplified. The fitted corset bodice emphasizing a figure that was somehow more stunning than it had ever been. The strapless sweetheart neckline and sheer side mesh. Panels revealed glimpses of toned skin that suggested months of personal trainers and yoga studios rather than the chocolate binges and wine-soaked self-pity everyone had imagined. But it wasn't just the dress, though it was magnificent. It wasn't even her body, though she moved with a new kind of confidence that made every step look like choreography. It was something in her face, something in the way she carried herself, as if she had shed not just her old life, but her old limitations, emerging as someone entirely new and infinitely more powerful. Her hair fell in loose Hollywood waves over one shoulder, catching the light like spun silk, and when she smiled, not the practiced, polite smile of a society wife, but a genuine expression of someone who was exactly where she wanted to be. The photographer from Vogue actually lowered his camera for a moment, apparently stunned. Clara paused just inside the doorway, not because she was nervous or unsure, but because she understood the power of a moment. She let the room absorb her presence, let every person there recalibrate their expectations and assumptions. Then she began to move, and it was like watching a goddess walk among mortals. She didn't look toward Daniel's table. She didn't scan the room searching for familiar faces or hostile glares. Instead, she moved with purpose toward a table near the back, a table she had specifically requested, populated by some of the city's most influential business leaders and philanthropists. "My God!" Amanda Sterling breathed, grabbing Margaret Pemberton's arm. "Look at her. She's magnificent." Margaret could only nod, speechless for perhaps the first time in her gossipy life. This wasn't the broken woman they'd all expected to see. This wasn't even the woman they remembered from before. The dutiful wife who had always been beautiful but somehow secondary, always standing slightly behind her husband in photographs. This Clara commanded attention in a way that seemed effortless and absolute. At the head table, Sienna felt her carefully constructed confidence crack like ice on a frozen pond. "She looks—" Sienna started, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence because there was no good way to complete it. Clara looked incredible. Clara looked like she had won something enormous and was just now letting everyone else know about it. Daniel was staring, and he wasn't even trying to hide it. His eyes followed Clara's path through the room, taking in every detail of her transformation. This wasn't the woman he had left. This was someone entirely new, someone who had taken the pain of his betrayal and alchemized it into something that looked remarkably like power. "Daniel," Sienna hissed, her voice sharp with warning. "Stop staring." But he couldn't stop. None of them could. Clara had reached her table and was greeting her dinner companions. Victor Chen, the tech billionaire, Isabella Romano, the art gallery owner whose opinion could make or break a career, Thomas Whitmore, whose real estate empire spanned 3 continents. These weren't people who accepted just anyone into their circle. These were people who had to be impressed, who had to see value in an association. And they were all standing to greet Clara like she was exactly where she belonged. Flash of cameras began in earnest now, but the focus had shifted dramatically from the head tables to wherever Clara was standing. She posed graciously with her table companions, laughed at something Victor said, kissed Isabella's cheek with genuine affection. Every movement was captured, every smile analyzed, every gesture dissected by a room full of people who were rapidly realizing they had been telling themselves the wrong story for 8 months. The foundation president, still at the podium, seemed to sense the shift in the room's energy. He paused in his remarks, following the collective gaze of his audience, and when he spotted Clara, his face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, abandoning his prepared speech, "I see we have a very special guest with us tonight. Clara Ashworth, whose generous support has been instrumental in our new pediatric wing, has honored us with her presence." The applause that followed was thunderous, and it lasted longer than protocol dictated. This wasn't polite charity gala clapping. This was recognition, appreciation, even awe. Clara rose gracefully, acknowledged the room with a nod that managed to be both humble and regal, then sat back down as if this level of attention was simply what she expected from life now. Sienna's hands were shaking. The photographers who had been focused on her table all evening were now completely absorbed with getting shots of Clara, the mysterious woman who had vanished for 8 months and returned as someone none of them recognized, but all of them wanted to know. At that moment, watching his ex-wife command the room with an authority he had never seen in her before, Daniel Ashworth began to understand that he had made a mistake far larger than he had ever imagined. He had thought he was trading up, choosing excitement over stability, youth over maturity. But looking at Clara now, he realized he hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost the one person who had truly understood him, who had seen his potential and helped him become more than he ever could have been alone. The night was just beginning, but the real story was already being written. Clara Ashworth hadn't just returned to society. She had arrived as its newest queen. And everyone in that ballroom was starting to realize they had been fools to count her out. The first course had barely been served when the gravitational pull of the room became undeniable. Every conversation, every photograph, every meaningful glance was being drawn inexorably toward Clara's table. What had begun as polite curiosity about her appearance had evolved into something more powerful, genuine fascination. Victor Chen, the tech mogul whose company had gone public the previous year with a valuation that made financial headlines worldwide, was deep in animated conversation with Clara about something that had him taking notes on his phone. Isabella Romano, whose gallery had launched 3 artists to international fame in the past year alone, was laughing at something Clara had said with the kind of delighted surprise reserved for people who've just discovered they're talking to someone far more interesting than expected. But it was Thomas Whitmore's reaction that sent the first real shockwaves through the society watchers in the room. Whitmore was notorious for his reserve, for the careful way he chose his business associations and social connections. He was old money, careful money, the kind of man who moved in circles so exclusive that most people didn't even know they existed. Yet here he was, leaning forward with obvious interest as Clara spoke, occasionally nodding with the kind of respect usually reserved for equals. "What could they possibly be talking about?" Sienna muttered, trying to keep her voice low while craning her neck for a better view. She had abandoned any pretense of enjoying her dinner, her attention completely consumed by the tableau playing out across the room. Daniel was wondering the same thing, but with a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with recognition. He was beginning to remember things about Clara that he had somehow forgotten during their marriage. The sharp intelligence that she had always kept carefully modulated in social situations, the way she had possessed an almost uncanny ability to understand people's motivations and desires, the business insights she had offered him in private that had proven, time and again, to be remarkably astute. He had loved those qualities once, had been attracted to her mind as much as her beauty. But somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing them. Clara had become so good at being supportive, at being the perfect corporate wife, that he had forgotten she was brilliant in her own right. Now, watching her command the attention of some of the most powerful people in the city, he was being forced to remember exactly who he had married and who he had lost. The revelation came during the Foundation president's main address, when he announced the evening's major donations. The first few were predictable, 7 figures from the usual suspects, the kind of wealthy families who had been making these donations for generations. But then he paused, his voice carrying a note of particular excitement. "Tonight, I'm especially thrilled to announce a very special commitment," he said, looking directly toward Clara's table. "Thanks to the extraordinary generosity of one of our board members, we will be breaking ground next spring on the Clara Ashworth Center for Pediatric Innovation, a state-of-the-art research facility dedicated to developing breakthrough treatments for childhood cancers." The applause was immediate and sustained, but more important was the figure that appeared on the screens around the ballroom: $15 million. Not a donation, an endowment, funding in perpetuity, the kind of philanthropic commitment that typically came from foundations built over generations, not individuals. Sienna felt the blood drain from her face. $15 million was more than generous. It was transformative, the kind of gift that put Clara's name on buildings and established her as a major philanthropic force in the city. But where had the money come from? Clara's divorce settlement had been substantial, but not $15 million gift substantial. The answer came in whispers that began to circulate during the dessert course, carried by society reporters who had been making calls to their sources throughout the evening. Clara hadn't just disappeared for 8 months. She had been building something. Using her divorce settlement as seed money, she had quietly launched an investment fund focused on women-led startups in the healthcare and technology sectors. 3 of her early investments had already gone public with enormous valuations, and 2 more were rumored to be close to major acquisition deals. The woman they had all assumed was hiding in shame had actually been constructing a business empire. She hadn't just survived Daniel's betrayal. She had used it as fuel for the most successful career pivot anyone could remember. "She's not just back," Amanda Sterling whispered to Margaret Pemberton as they watched Clara pose for photographs with the foundation's board. She's bigger than she ever was before. The social media explosion had begun in earnest now, with Erie's Clara Ashworth return trending across multiple platforms. The photos being posted weren't just of her dress or her appearance. They were of her surrounded by business leaders, shaking hands with politicians, embracing the children from the hospital who had been brought to thank the major donors. Every image told the same story. Clara wasn't a victim returning to scene of her humiliation. She was a success story making her victory lap. By the time the dancing began, the shift in the room's dynamics was complete. The receiving line that had formed around Daniel and Sienna's table during cocktails had evaporated, migrating to Clara's side of the ballroom. Young entrepreneurs were introducing themselves, hoping for a moment of her time. Established business leaders were exchanging cards with her. Social photographers were clamoring for group shots that would establish their subject's connection. To the woman who was rapidly becoming the evening's undisputed star, Sienna watched it all with growing desperation. This was supposed to be her night, her introduction to society as Daniel's wife, her chance to establish herself as the new power player in their social circle. Instead, she was being systematically ignored, rendered invisible by the gravitational pull of Daniel's ex-wife. "We should go," she said suddenly, her voice sharp with barely contained panic. "This is humiliating. Everyone's staring at her instead of us." But Daniel couldn't leave. Couldn't stop watching Clara move through the crowd with the kind of natural authority he had spent years trying to cultivate. She wasn't performing for the cameras or working the room in any obvious way. She was simply being herself, and that self was magnetic in a way that seemed to surprise even her. At one point, Clara's eyes found his across the room. For just a moment, their gazes locked, and Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a connection, a recognition, a flash of the intimacy they had once shared. But there was something else in Clara's expression, something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. She wasn't angry or hurt or bitter. She was grateful. She looked at him with something that resembled appreciation, as if his betrayal had been not a wound, but a gift, a necessary push that had forced her to discover who she really was without him. Then she smiled, not the polite, careful smile of a society wife, but something warmer and more genuine, and turned back to her conversation, leaving Daniel with the stunning realization that she had not just moved on from him. She had moved beyond him entirely. The evening was drawing to a close, but the real story was just beginning. Clara Ashworth hadn't just made a successful return to society, she had redefined what success looked like. And as the city's elite watched her prepare to leave, they all understood the same thing. The balance of power had shifted, and Clara was now the one holding all the cards. The final dance of the evening was traditionally a waltz, played by the full orchestra as the city's most prominent couples took the floor in a carefully choreographed display of elegance and social harmony. Daniel extended his hand to Sienna, but even as they moved through the familiar steps, his eyes kept drifting to the edge of the ballroom where Clara stood with Victor Chen and Isabella Romano, declining their invitations to dance with gracious smiles and quiet words that sent them away looking charmed rather than rejected. She was preparing to leave. Daniel could see it in the subtle way she was gathering her small, beaded clutch, the graceful manner in which she was making her farewells. The realization hit him like a physical blow. She was going to walk out of here, having completely transformed the evening's narrative without ever speaking to him, without even acknowledging his presence beyond that single, devastating glance they had shared. "Daniel!" Sienna hissed, her fingers digging into his shoulder as she tried to guide his attention back to their dance. "People are watching." But he barely heard her. Across the room, Clara was embracing Thomas Whitmore with the kind of warmth usually reserved for old friends, though Daniel knew for certain they had never been particularly close during his marriage to Clara. Whitmore was saying something that made Clara laugh, a sound that carried across the ballroom despite the music, a sound Daniel suddenly realized he hadn't heard in years, not even during the supposedly happy times of their marriage. When had Clara stopped laughing like that with him? When had their conversations become perfunctory exchanges about schedules and social obligations? When had he stopped noticing that his wife was one of the most genuinely intelligent, insightful people he had ever known? The questions came too late, of course. They always did. As the final notes of the waltz faded, Clara made her move toward the exit. But she didn't slink out quietly as Sienna had predicted and hoped. Instead, her departure became an event in itself. People stopped her every few steps, wanting one last word, one final photograph, one more moment in the orbit of someone who had just redefined what it meant to make a comeback. The foundation president intercepted her near the ballroom's entrance, taking her hands in both of his with obvious emotion. "Clara," he said, his voice carrying despite the crowd, "I can't thank you enough. The Children's Hospital, what you've done tonight will change everything." "The children change everything," Clara replied, her voice warm but clear enough for nearby listeners to hear. "I'm just grateful I can help give them better futures. That's what matters." It was exactly the right thing to say. Humble without being self-deprecating, philanthropic without being performative. But watching her, Daniel realized it wasn't calculated. Clara genuinely meant it. Somewhere during their marriage, he had forgotten that his wife possessed not just intelligence and beauty, but actual goodness, a quality that had become increasingly rare in their social circle. The photographers clustered around her exit, and Clara posed for a few final shots with the kind of natural grace that can't be taught or faked. The golden dress caught the light from the chandeliers one last time, and she looked, Daniel thought, with a sharp pang of loss, absolutely radiant. Not just beautiful, radiant with the kind of inner light that comes from someone who has discovered exactly who they're meant to be. "Clara!" The voice cut through the crowd, and Daniel's heart stopped as he realized it was his own. He hadn't consciously decided to call out to her, but the word had escaped anyway, carrying 8 months of regret and confusion, and something that might have been desperation. The ballroom fell silent. Every conversation stopped. Every person turned to watch what would happen next. Clara paused at the threshold, her back still to him, and for a moment, Daniel thought she might ignore him entirely. Then she turned, slowly, with the kind of serene composure that suggested she had been expecting this moment all along. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Daniel felt the weight of everything he had lost, everything he had thrown away, for what he had convinced himself was an upgrade. Sienna stood beside him, her face pale with humiliation and growing fury, but he barely registered her presence. All he could see was Clara, beautiful and self-possessed, and utterly, completely beyond his reach. "Congratulations on everything," Clara said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "I hope you'll be very happy together." The words were perfectly polite, perfectly appropriate, and delivered with a sincerity that made them devastating. She wasn't being sarcastic or bitter. She genuinely meant it. And that genuine wish for his happiness, after everything he had done to her, after the humiliation and pain he had caused, was perhaps the most powerful thing she could have said, because it made clear, to everyone watching, exactly who was the better person. And it made equally clear that she didn't need him anymore, didn't want him anymore, didn't even think about him enough to be angry. Clara smiled then, not at Daniel, but at the room in general, a gracious acknowledgement of the evening and everyone who had made it memorable. Then she turned and walked out into the December night, her head held high, her spine straight, her golden dress glittering under the streetlights like armor made of starlight. The silence in the ballroom lasted for several heartbeats after she disappeared. Then the conversations resumed, but they were different now. Subdued, thoughtful, charged with the recognition that they had all just witnessed something extraordinary. Not just a social comeback, but a genuine transformation. Clara Ashworth had walked into that ballroom as a woman they had written off and walked out as someone they would never underestimate again. Daniel stood frozen in the middle of the dance floor, his arms still extended from where Sienna had pulled away from him in mortification. Around him, the evening continued, but he was no longer part of it. For the first time in 8 months, he understood exactly what he had given up. Not just a wife, but a partner. Not just beauty, but substance. Not just someone who supported his dreams, but someone who had been capable of building dreams far bigger than his own. Sienna was saying something to him, her voice sharp with anger and embarrassment, but he couldn't focus on her words. All he could think about was Clara, walking alone into the night, free of him, free of their old life, free to become whoever she wanted to be next. And despite everything, despite his regret and his loss and his slowly dawning understanding of the magnitude of his mistake, Daniel found himself hoping that she would be happy. Because after tonight, after seeing who she had become, he finally understood that Clara Ashworth deserved nothing less than everything the world had to offer. She had walked away from the wreckage of their marriage and built something beautiful from the ashes. She had taken his betrayal and transformed it into triumph. And as the city's elite filed out of the Plaza Hotel that night, they all carried the same story with them. The story of a woman who had refused to be broken by the worst thing that had ever happened to her, who had instead used it as the foundation for the most spectacular reinvention anyone had ever witnessed. Clara Ashworth had won, and in winning, she had shown them all what victory actually looked like. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing. We post powerful real-life stories every day that explore the depths of human connection, the courage to change, and the lasting impact of love that transcends even loss.